Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to McCormick Lounge here in Coffee Hall at Loyola University Chicago. As I always say, on the majestic banks of Lake Michigan. We're good to see you. Thanks for coming out tonight. The weather is turning, we notice, so we appreciate your coming out and being part of this. It's going to be a really wonderful talk by Chris Bellitto. There's lots of things to say about Chris, but this blurb on the book, Chris, kind of gets me every time from, I think it's Ahmed Safi, Dr. Safi from Duke University, these are called blurbs. Maybe one day you'll have a book blurbed by Dr. Diaz or Dr. Bellitto or myself, or you'll blurb yourself. But here's a blurb, and here's what this says. We live in an age of bombast, vitriol, and ego. In the midst of what seems like an endless sea of self-promotion and even self-realization that seems cut off from a grander, more divine self, humility is indeed a most urgent virtue. Bellitto's book is a balm for the heart. So it's hard to kind of follow up there, but I think in my reading of it, I felt really energized and recovered, and I felt a lot of perspective was given. And I know that Chris is an excellent teacher and speaker, and I trust you're going to be kind of proposed in those thoughts as well, or maybe even led or recalled to think them. So we look forward to Chris's talk. A word about Dr. Christopher M. Bellitto. He's a medievalist, a church historian, a professor of history at Kean University in Union, New Jersey, where he teaches courses in ancient and medieval history. Chris has twice been a Fulbright specialist at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, 2023, and the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, also known as the Shire. That was in 2019. In 2021-22, he was visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary. He has twice won grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. An NEH Public Scholar Grant in 2021 allowed him to complete his latest book, this one we have before us, Humility, the Secret of a Lost Virtue. In 2010 to 2012, he was awarded an NEH Enduring Questions Grant, which is a great grant, and I hope it holds on. But this grant was to develop a course and public programming on the theme, Is There Such Thing as a Just War? Before I invite Chris up, I want to say one thing, that we have books. Usually we sell books here in the bookstore, but that's drying up because the bookstore can't do it anymore. So we have 20 copies in the center. If after you hear this you want a copy, just drop by and we'll give you one for free. It's really a book you want to read, or if you think someone in your family might enjoy it, please drop by. I also want to thank, I'm Mike Murphy, by the way, from the Hank Center. I direct it. I love it. It's great. We have a great staff. I want to thank Katie, Jules, Vincent, Mary, and Duncan, who's filming. Thanks for your great work. And I know Chris feels welcomed here, and I want to add my welcome to that, and let us all put our hands together for Chris Bellitto.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Oh, you have slides. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was distracted. He's using slides.
So let me begin before we start by saying this is not one of these occasions. This book is not, I'm so humble and you can be too. I lost 100 pounds in a month and you can too. I am in no way putting myself forward as someone who is an exemplar of humility. I found it an interesting topic. And so what I want to do today in about 35 minutes, and then I would enjoy some conversation, is talk about the genesis of the book and why I think it's an important topic, and kind of give you the guts of the book. I want to thank Mike and Katie especially, because Katie is one of those people who makes institutes run. And without Katie, Mike's in trouble, right? And I also want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities. They have a program called the Public Scholar Grant, and it's money so that people can stop teaching, which I enjoy doing very much, but it's very hard to write a book when you're teaching full-time, and to finish books that are written for a broad audience. So you'll notice that it's called the Public Scholar Grant. And it was this grant that allowed me to finish the research that I had been doing during COVID, a humbling experience for all of us, and to write a book not for 5 people with 900 footnotes, but I deliberately wanted to write a book that people would read. When I was shopping the book around, one publisher said, because it's kind of a small book on a big theme, and one publisher said, why didn't you write a 400-page book on the history of humility? And my response was, because I want people to read it, right? And you've all seen 4-hour movies that could have been 2.5 hours. You know that one, right? And so that's the genesis of this book. The book came from a prior book. Every book I've written, I know the next book I'm going to write while I'm finishing the other. It didn't happen this time. No book has presented itself. It could be that at the age of 59, I've written my last book, and if so, this would be fine for me. But about 10 years ago, I decided, being a good Catholic, I had never read the Bible. And so I was going to try to read the Bible from the beginning to the end. And as I was getting older, I decided that I'm supposed to be getting wiser, and it wasn't happening. So I read the Bible from the beginning to the end and tried to talk about how the Bible talks about wisdom and the elders. And humility kept coming up. And I made a very early decision that I would separate that material out so that I would put it into a different book. And I want you to just remember this little image here, because I'm going to show you the wider painting that this image from the humility book comes from. Now, of course, the problem of talking about humility is that there's a joke involved in everything, right? So a rabbi friend of mine, I do a lot of work back in New Jersey with a rabbi partner. We do a lot of presentations on Judaism and Christianity. And he really gave the epigram to the book, "Too humble is half pride, half proud." It's very, very hard to say, look how humble I am. You know, you can just fill the world with these kinds of jokes. And so I decided to just kind of embrace it by looking at C.S. Lewis. So you know C.S. Lewis from the Narnia Chronicles, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? But there's a better book that he wrote, a very short book called The Screwtape Letters, which is about an undersecretary of hell named Screwtape, who's teaching his nephew, Wormwood, how to corrupt a soul. And in this particular series of letters, there's one particular letter where the patient, the soul that Wormwood is assigned to condemn, starts to learn about virtue. That's no good. He wants him to learn about vice. So he says, your patients become humble. Have you drawn his attention to the fact? Catch him at the moment when he's really poor in spirit and smuggle into his mind the gratifying reflection, by Jove, I'm being humble. And almost immediately, pride at his own humility will appear. This is the problem with talking about humility. So let's just run right into it. In the 5th century, Augustine, you may have heard of Augustine of Hippo, was asked to name the 3 most important virtues. You know that in real estate, the 3 most important things are location, location, and location. And Augustine says the 3 most important virtues are humility, humility, and humility. A wonderful medieval abbess named Hildegard of Bingen, you should know who she is, wrote a play where she said the queen of the virtues is humility, and all of the other virtues don't know what to do without her. She's the captain of the team. On the other side of that, you may have noticed in politics, in sports, it drives me crazy when a linebacker does exactly what he's supposed to do. Tackle the guy with the ball, stands up and starts prancing around like he's just discovered the cure for cancer. These are the people I want to slap across the face. And Flannery O'Connor, someone who you may have read, was asked, what's the great Catholic sin? And she replied, smugness. Nowhere do we read in the Beatitudes where we read, blessed are the poor and blessed are the meek. Nowhere do we read, blessed are the smug, for they shall strut. But that's the problem in our country today. Pride is dangerous. Now, I want to be careful about the word pride, because pride can be a good thing. We want to be proud of our efforts. You're proud when you think you're going to get a C and you end up with a B. Those are all good things. Here I want to talk about arrogance, or what the Greeks called hubris, overweening pride, thinking too high of yourself. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous because if you think too high of yourself, that means you're thinking less of others. Little kids say what? Me first. What's the opposite of me first? you second. Not exactly a Judeo-Christian Islamic value. Not exactly the common good. You second. It should be you first. You go first. And so I think we're living in a rather coarse country right now, a country where people don't care about other people. I think about COVID. Remember COVID? How can we forget? Remember, everyone said, wear a mask and protect other people, and people resisted that. I think the messaging was wrong. If we said, wear a mask and protect yourself, everyone would have worn a mask, because nobody cares about other people. And so there's an empathy gap. And so as I was doing this research, I must tell you, it went from being an intellectual exercise to maybe some of my work can be applied to the church, the country, the world, your community, your neighborhood, in which we live today. And if you are so sure of yourself, and boy, we know a lot of people who are so sure of themselves, there's no need to listen to anybody else. You don't need anybody else. Well, I can tell you that always leads to a fall. When you think you have everything, then you don't have to give rights to anyone else. You don't have to listen to anyone else because you have all of the answers. Every single person in this room has had a boss like that. It's a terrible management principle, right? It's a terrible management principle. You are not, you and your cell phone, me and my cell phone, I am not the center of the universe. And this is something that was pointed out all throughout history, but particularly in this wonderful lecture that was given in Switzerland in 1871. Sorry, ladies, this gentleman, Jakob Burckhardt, is using the gendered language of his time. So we would say, for each person regards as all time fulfilled in his own, and can't see his own as one of many passing waves, just as if the world and its history had existed merely for our sakes. The world did not begin the second you were born, and it's not going to go dark when we die. And that's a good thing. It's better to think of yourself as a link in a chain. And humility, I think, can help us do this, proper humility. History and literature are full of people who caused their own downfalls. Richard Nixon, Napoleon, Julius Caesar. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is not one of the history plays. The title of Shakespeare's play is The Tragedy of Julius Caesar. What might have been, what he could have been. In literature, Oedipus Rex, Lord and Lady Macbeth, Voldemort. These are all historical and literary examples of pride that, as the expression goes before a fall. And this is represented, if you ever go to the New York Historical Society, come to New York. We have lots of good museums, just like you have here, and I visited your museums on past trips. But right next to the Museum of Natural History is a little jewel called the New York Historical Society. And in that museum, you'll see 5 paintings. And each painting is about the size of that screen. I've put them in a stack. And it's by Thomas Cole, and it's The Course of Empire. And it's a reminder that what goes up must come down. In the upper left-hand corner, unsullied, nothing built, beautiful central Rome, where Ambassador Diaz spent so many times serving our country, and we thank him for that. Now Rome begins to be built, and then Rome is in its glory. But what happens? Rome falls. And what's left? Well, what's left became the cover of my book. And the reason that I liked that image is because there's a sadness there. There was something great that is gone, but it's still there, and we can recover it. And that's what I want us to do, recover the lost virtue. So how did I write this book? I'm an historian. We begin at the beginning. We put it all out, and we read it chronologically. So what did I do? I started by looking at the very etymology of the word humility. It comes from the word humus, not hummus, ground chickpeas with pita chips. Of the earth, grounded, solid. You know people like this, they have their feet on the ground. You also know people who aren't like this. They have their heads in the clouds, right? It's grounded. And then I looked at Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources because there's a lot of material on this. I also looked at epics. So Harry Potter is an epic. Lord of the Rings is an epic. Someone goes on a journey, goes on a quest. What does Sam say? Samwise Gamgee, who is really the hero of Lord of the Rings, I wish this didn't have to happen in our lifetime. And what does Gandalf say? But it has happened in our lifetime. And what we make of what's happened, that's going to show the measure of our character. Arthurian legends, the Bhagavad Gita, Gilgamesh, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, they're all the same. They're all people trying to find themselves. So I looked at questing literature. I looked at Greco-Roman literature because I was sure that the answer was, without religion, there is no humility, because I was being arrogant as a believer. Not true. Absolutely not true. I'm going to show you that as well. And then I looked at morality plays and saints' lives, and then I looked at cautionary tales. We'll look at Faustus and Frankenstein, both of them Voldemort, and some modern philosophy. So let's begin with the Hebrew vocabulary and a word that is translated incorrectly, fear of God. Abram and Sarah, Esther, they're not afraid of God. That's not what the word fear means. They're in awe of God. They're in awe of something that is bigger than you. Some people in this room have had this experience. If you haven't had this experience, I pray that you will have this experience. But when someone who doesn't have to love you, I'm talking about your parents, because we have to love you. But when someone who doesn't have to love you loves you, it's this awe-inspiring experience, because you have this experience, right? You know, right? You could cry a little bit. It's okay. I'm with you. I feel you. This experience that it's not that I'm bad. It's not that I'm small and bad. It means that I'm in the hands of something greater. That's why Moses takes his feet off at the burning bush, because he realizes his smallness relative to Yahweh's bigness, but it doesn't make him less than. He just understands his place in the universe. Sometimes we're the key player, and sometimes we're in the background, right? That's how it is in our lives. And it's that context, that self-understanding. It's not self-deprecating. It's not low self-esteem. It's nothing like that. It's simply understanding what you have done in your life that you need to ask forgiveness for. So Yom Kippur, which we celebrated, our Jewish brothers and sisters celebrated about a month ago, late this year. Christmas and Hanukkah, same day this year. First night of Hanukkah is Christmas. Extraordinary. The night before Yom Kippur, which we say Eve is Erev Yom Kippur, before you ask God for forgiveness, you're supposed to go to the people that you offended and ask them for forgiveness. That's humbling. I want you right now to think about going to your sister and saying, I hurt you, I'm sorry, forgive me. Yeah, that's not going to go well. That's tough. That's a tough pill to swallow. But Erev Yom Kippur is an exercise in humility. And so the words that we have that I was following, I'm obviously running through very, very quickly the guts of this book, hoping that you will, of course, run out and buy it. They make lovely stocking stuffers, and I have to put my daughter through college somehow. So we have ancient Greek ideas. When I began the book, I had preconceptions. Whenever I teach, I always say to my students, what are your preconceptions about? When I think of medieval England, I think ... Then I try to revisit my preconceptions. My preconception was all the Greeks and the Romans didn't understand humility, and then there's Jesus. Wrong. I've already shown you the Jewish tradition, which predates Jesus, and Jesus, of course, was a good Jew, as was Mary, as was Peter, and all of the other first followers. The Greeks have this word called hubris, sometimes translated with a Y, sometimes translated with a U, just because the Greek letter is coming over. And it's overweening arrogance. Do you remember Icarus? He tries to fly too high. His father says, I'm going to make us wings. The wings are going to be made of feathers and wax. Don't fly too close to the sun, because the sun will melt the wax. What does the idiot son do? Exactly what your parents tell you not to do. I did the same thing. My parents said, don't do it. That's the first thing I did. Of course, I'm a kid. Of course I'm going to do that. And he falls for his own reason. He tries to go too high. That's what excessive pride is, or arrogance. The very word narcissism comes from Narcissus, who is so in love with himself that he actually drowns because he's trying to kiss the person he sees reflected in the water, and that's him. Some of you may have a roommate like this. I hope not. But on the other side is Aristotle. And we tend to think virtue, vice. Aristotle puts virtue between two vices. So bravery or courage is between being stupid and reckless and being timid. Humility, what he calls pride, we mean humility, stands between thinking too much of yourself, hubris, and thinking too little of yourself. And so there's a sense of balance. I feel that my church, I'm a Catholic, I feel that my country is out of balance. You know when your relationships are out of balance? You know when your body is out of balance, right? A way of restoring balance is to think of virtue as a fulcrum. And so the star of the show here is Socrates. So you may know the Delphic Oracle. The Delphic Oracle is the mouthpiece of the god Apollo. Someone goes to the god Apollo and says, "Who is the wisest man in the world?" And the answer is Socrates. Well, the next question becomes, why? And the answer was because he knows that he knows nothing. And this freaks Socrates out. So he goes walking around Athens, and he goes to all of the people that they say are really smart. And he asks them a whole bunch of questions, and he realizes they're full of it. Wouldn't you love Socrates to have a talk show with politicians today? Sign me up. And he walks around, he goes to the person who's supposed to be the smartest person, realizes the person is full of it, and he says, well, you know, I'm wiser than this man for this one reason. He thinks he knows something when he doesn't, whereas when I don't know, neither do I think I know. He's being humble about what he knows and what he doesn't know. And once you know what you don't know, that's the course you take to fill in the blank, to fill in the pothole. But at the same time in the ancient world, we do have an attitude, and there are people in our country and in our church today. I'm more American than you are. I'm more Muslim than you are. I'm more Jewish or Catholic or Christian than you are. In order to raise myself up, I'm going to put you down. This is a very Roman concept. The Romans give us the notion of humiliation. Slaves are less than. What we would call working or middle class are less than. People who work with their hands are less than. A POW is less than. In fact, if the Romans took you in battle, they made you do the ancient version of the limbo. They put a spear here, a spear here, a spear here, and you had to bend down and walk underneath them to show that you are bending down to Rome. Game of Thrones, bend the knee. That's what this is about. And so this is lowliness is absolutely negative. Now, can you imagine what happens when Jesus comes along? Jesus, a good Jew, an inheritor of that whole tradition, and he takes the Roman system and turns it entirely upside down. The last shall be first. The least shall be greatest. The slave shall be the master. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who suffer. And so Jesus, the God who becomes human and washes people's feet. No Roman would wash someone else's feet. I met a man once, and he said to me, when I die, I want my name on a tombstone, and it says, he washed feet. I thought, what an aspiration, that people will remember you as someone who washed the feet, metaphorically or literally, of others. And so the Pope becomes the servant of the servants of God. In a monastery or a convent, all the monks and the nuns serve each other. Those who exalt themselves shall be humbled. We see this also in the Muslim tradition. Again, I'm racing through all of this. I called Omid Safi, as a matter of fact, at Duke, and I called him and a number of other people, my friends, who are Muslim or scholars of Islam, and I said, so what's the word? What's the word for humility? And they said, we don't have one. It's baked into the very system of Islam, of submission, of obedience to Allah. It has something to do with patience. It has a very positive sense of meekness. And so they gave me stuff to read. And when I read, charity does not increase wealth, no one forgives except that Allah increases his honor, and no one humbles himself for the sake of Allah except that Allah raises his status, I hear Jesus saying, anyone who exalts himself shall be humbled, and those who humble themselves shall be exalted. So the religious tradition is important here. And what do I find? I find someone I never met before, Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali, who was described to me as the medieval Muslim Socrates. And he writes a memoir, and he looks back at his life and he goes, when I was young, I was really stupid because I thought I knew stuff. And the more I learned, the more I realized I didn't know anything. And he records this in his memoir, which he calls The Beginning of Guidance. Pride, arrogance, boastfulness are chronic diseases of, quote, again, using the gendered language of the time, we'll say human's consideration of himself with the eye of self-glorification and self-importance. The result is that he's always starting his sentences with I. And just like Socrates, if I meet someone who knows something that I don't know, I don't tear him down, I ask him questions. I try to learn from the other. And this is captured in a wonderful phrase that was very popular in the Middle Ages called learned ignorance, docta ignorantia in Latin. And an example of this is someone that I study very closely, Jean Gerson. I lived most of my life in the 15th century. And he says, discretion is the daughter of humility. Once you are humble, you get perspective. You gain discretion. You calm down your own zeal. You don't think you know it all. You're not rushing to tell everybody else that you know it all. And this he's getting from the tradition of Plato and Aristotle, and it's tied to a sense of the common good. And I wonder, and perhaps we can talk about this later, or you can think about this in your own courses, if this isn't a key to returning to the United States of America, because we are very disunited. Very, very disunited. So the implications for citizenship of humility being tied to the common good become very important. And I'll give you an example of this. Now, I am not good at math. We have mathematicians and computer science people here. Someone else does my taxes. Yet a mathematical example is helpful. So we've got this guy named Nicholas of Cusa. He writes a book called On Learned Ignorance. And he says, the way I want to explain this to you is I want to use some math. We got a circle. That's all that there is to know. Now we have a polygon. A polygon is a multi-sided image, right? It could be 5 sides, a pentagram, hexagon, octagon. You take the image, the figure with the straight lines, and you stick it inside the circle. No matter how close you get that inside figure, it's never going to be a circle, because it can't be, because the circle is round and the polygon is straight. And in between is the unknowable. And you just have to be okay with the fact that there's always something yet to know that you won't ever know. As he puts it, it's fitting that we be learned in a certain ignorance, so that not grasping the precision of truth as it is, we may at least be led to this, that we may see the very thing which we are unable to comprehend. Now, in his context, he's talking about God. But define love, define hate, define poetry, define the transcendence of music. You can't. It's beyond words. You don't have to be a religious believer to believe that. So these two images, I think, are helpful. Now let's go to our man, Ignatius. Ignatius, if you don't know the story, now I also have to tell you that I was trained by Jesuits, and like you, Jesuits plant a chip in your brain, and you will find later in your life that if you ever go more than 15 minutes without mentioning the Jesuits, they move this satellite, and they like zap you. Ignatius, at the end of his life, dictates a memoir. He does it very reluctantly. He doesn't want to talk about himself, in Spanish, in which he describes himself as a young jerk. Up to the age of 26, he writes in the third person, he was a man given to the follies of the world, and what he enjoyed most was exercise with arms, having a great and foolish desire to win frames. In your own library, there is an image of Ignatius throwing away a sword and holding up a cross. I have to tell you that earlier, yesterday when I first saw it, I swear to God, I thought it was Joan of Arc, which is kind of could be. And in his biography, I found this wonderful anecdote where his aunt, always listen to the wise old ladies in your family. And this wise old lady, his Auntie Maria, Tia Maria, said to him, you know, you're such a young jerk. And he says, Inigo, you'll never learn sense until someone breaks one of your legs. Well, in fact, of course, that's exactly what happened at the Battle of Pamplona in May 1521. He and his brother ride up. They see that they are outnumbered 10-1. His brother goes, yeah, I don't want a piece of this, and leaves. And Inigo, of course, he goes up. Cannonball goes through his legs. He's got to go through surgery. You know the story, right? He goes through surgery. After surgery, one of his legs is shorter than the other, and he doesn't like that because he won't look good in his tights. So he has his leg broken again, and it's after the second operation. This is how thick he is. It's after the second operation that he finally has this experience. And he comes to really, we have this notion, some people are born humble, others have humility thrust upon them. Ignatius was one of these people. And at the age of 33, he realizes, well, I need to get some advanced theology. I need to know Latin. His Latin was terrible. And at the age of 33, he crams himself into a grammar school in Barcelona. And you can imagine all of these kids looking at this disabled war veteran saying, what a freak. Like, what is with this guy? But he knew that he had to go back to the basics, even though it was probably humiliating. And finally, in the Spiritual Exercises, his great handbook, which runs 4 weeks, he's writing in Spanish, and he uses this expression, humildad amorosa. There's one phrase. If there are two phrases I would like you to walk away from this evening, one is learned in ignorance, and the other is loving humility. And he says there are 2 steps to it, and for some reason that should be 1, 2, and 3, and I don't know why it didn't work out that way. But it should be 1, 2, and 3. The first step is to voluntarily obey laws and understand that people know better. The second is to kind of give yourself up to whatever may be will be. You say, I'd like to do this, but I'll do whatever you tell me to do. You see, he's putting you first over me first. And the last is to choose the right path. So if I numbered this correctly, which I didn't, it would be 1 + 2 = 3. Do you see that? I told you, not good at math. So let's move along to the last section, which is about cautionary tales. So Dr. Faustus is Voldemort, or rather Voldemort is Dr. Faustus, is Frankenstein. Faustus, an alchemist, who, by the way, probably was a real person, decides that he's going to sell his soul to the devil. Those of you who are studying American literature, you may know The Devil and Daniel Webster. It's a story that's retold again and again. And the devil says, I will give you the ability to turn base metals into gold and to figure all this other stuff. 20 years from now at midnight, I'm coming for your soul. Yeah, that'll never happen. That's 20 years from now. The devil will get his due. And when the devil comes calling, you can't get away. And so Christopher Marlowe, who was writing around the time of Shakespeare, ends his play, The Tragical History of, as he puts it, Faustus, Dr. Faustus, with the chorus singing this line, what might have been, cut is the branch that might have grown full straight, and burned is Apollo's laurel bough, that sometimes grew with this learned man. Faustus is gone, regard his hellish fall. He brought about his own demise. He brought about his own demise. And so does Frankenstein. Frankenstein is not the creature, by the way. And if you've never seen Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein, or Monty Python on the Holy Grail, I can't talk to you ever again. Put those on your list. Frankenstein is a young doctor who discovers the ability to animate dead flesh and make it live again. Frankenstein's not the creature, he's the creator. But he loses control of the creature, who ends up killing his father, his brother, and his wife on their wedding night. He sowed the seeds of his own destruction. And Mary Shelley, who was 19 when she wrote it, overachiever, 19 when she wrote this, begins, I won't read it through, but you're looking at it, begins with his declaration, I knew it, I found life, I can do it. And then by the end, he tells the audience, just like Faustus, learn from me. Learn from me how much you can lose if you try to overreach. And her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, writes a very famous poem called Ozymandias. I'm walking along a forest. I see these huge legs of stone, but I don't see any of the other statue. Where's the rest of the statue? It must have been a colossus. And on it, at the bottom, it reads, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. And so he looks around, and there's nothing. Nothing beside remains around the decay of that colossal wreck. So it's just another example. Eventually, what goes up must come down. Don't think too highly of yourself. Our favorite cynic, Jeff Goldblum, in Jurassic Park. The owner brings together mathematicians, brings together paleontologists and archaeologists and says, look, I put together dinosaurs from DNA. Well, we found 93% of the DNA, and we didn't know what to do with the rest, so we added 7% of frog DNA. What could go wrong? And Jeff Goldblum's character, Dr. Ian McKellen, gives a really important statement that we should think about as well when our technology is running ahead of our morality. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. Or as Ian McKellen says, the lack of humility before nature displayed here staggers me. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. And so I come to the words that anyone going to a class or a presentation wants to hear in conclusion. Come on, admit it. Two major takeaways. Having read this book, having read this material and written this book, I'm offering to you, as I do in the epilogue of this book, two major takeaways. The first is that humility is a fundamental stance. It's a disposition. Do you remember, for those of you who wear glasses, do you remember the first time you got glasses? Or when you get a new prescription and you go, I drove without these? For those of you who have fallen in love, for those of you who have been married, for those of you who have children, everything changes. It's a fundamental different disposition. For those of you who have lost a loved one who was close to you, it's the fundamental way you look through your life. And I am offering to you that if we all become a little more humble, I'm not talking about humiliation or low self-esteem. I'm talking about a healthy state of mind or being. We will get a better sense of perspective and proportion. Remember, discretion is the daughter of humility, said Jean Gerson. And I think that this will lead to dialogue because you'll realize what you don't know and you'll have to listen to other people. And I think it'll work. I hope it'll work against stubbornness and bullying. The second major takeaway is the danger. Humility makes you vulnerable. Who wants to be vulnerable? So does falling in love. So does becoming devoted to another person. So is caring for an aging relative that you don't want to care for. It makes you vulnerable. But I think humility makes you grateful as well. Now, I have to tell you, I could have wasted the last 6 years of my life. Not personally, but professionally. It could be that I am wrong, that humility is not a virtue. It could be that my information might be incomplete, my certainty might be based on sand, my enemy might be right, and I might need help. But I'm arguing that humility fights against fundamentalism. It pushes us toward moderation. It pushes us toward a sense of honor. And I hope that it can restore a sense of community and interdependence. But maybe I'm wrong. Thanks for listening to me. I'm going to go get a glass of water. I'll be right back. Where's the beer, Mike? Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's in the,
Oh, later. Later.
Okay, wonderful. Really appreciate it, Chris. Edifying and nourishing. We have about maybe 15 minutes, and we'll see where we get. But, you know, what ideas are alive in you as you hear this? It was a really great kind of journey through the book, but also the topic, you know, is unlocked. How do you think about humility? You heard the history of it. Maybe there's something alive in your own, like, observations today, your own life. Anybody have any thoughts at all? You're among friends. Any comment or question is most welcomed.
And nobody ever wants to do the first, so we'll go to the second.
Yeah. I can ask when to start. So, but I know that you'll think of something here. You mentioned that humility likes to be grounded in dialogue, and so this is the kind of thing I think about. So, like, if I'm speaking with somebody, you know, because I'm a fan of technology. I'm not anti-tech, but if you,
I am.
you are Luddite, yeah. And the one sense is that sometimes you can't get someone's eyes off their own screen. But even in a more basic sense, have you noticed ever when you're speaking with somebody and they're just waiting for you to finish? You know what I mean? And so they can say something, but they're not dialoguing. You follow me? There's lots of ways to go in this. So I think that's an act. Like, if I'm more humble, I'm moving to dialogue because I want to say, forget that. Let me listen to you. And then something's made between the two of us in our conversation that wouldn't have been there if I was artificially just thinking about myself and being so selfish. So does that stoke any thoughts in you, or do you want to comment on that at all, Chris? Or?
Just that Pope Francis talks about humble listening.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you seen any acts of humility in life? Is it attractive to you?
Thanks, Chris, for the talk. I just have a question. So I'm in the middle of a book right now called High Conflict by the journalist Amanda Ripley. And she talks a lot about how the work that conflict does in terms of identity and how attached we are to a particular identity or group, and how that leads to some of these postures of fundamentalism or whatever that can drive really intense conflict. And I was just curious in that context, in your research, if you came across any ideas about, like, the way identity is connected to humility, and how this humble posture can connect or detach us a little bit from those things? Or
Yes, I have. The big growth area in humility studies is among psychologists. And if I revisit this book 10 years from now, there'll be a lot more material, because psychologists are in the last 15 years have discovered humility and have been doing some data set testing and things like that. And a lot of it has to do with the formation of an identity and tribalism. Not just, we all need to know in our lives who we are in a positive way, right? So when you're in 6th grade, you do the immigration project and you try to find where your grandparents went through Ellis Island. That's all positive sense of identity. The negative side of identity is my identity is better than your identity. My identity is bigger than your identity. There's a lot of work being done by psychologists on this. I can't quote chapter and verse, it's in the bibliography. One of the funny things is that when you write a book, it takes a while for it to get published and then to get noted, and you're on the next project. So sometimes you have to actually read your own book on a plane when you're coming to give a talk. So I can't quite cite the chapter and verse, but if you send me an email, I can send you some information on that. But it's unfortunately going in the negative area of tribalism, right? Everyone's retreated to their camps. But my camp is better than your camp. I don't want you to invade my camp.
Thank you. Good evening.
Hello. Oh, this is weird. Okay. I just wanted to ask if you think that there are like any limits to humility and like the amount of openness that we should have in dialoguing with ideas that might be like dangerous or fundamental.
I don't think any of us should ever let ourselves be walked on or act as doormats. That's why I like the notion of Aristotle when he says there's a healthy pride or humility where you're not one way or the other. I think you always have to stand up for yourself. I think you always have to stand up for what is right, especially when there's a cost. That's an Ignatian tradition. It's not just an Ignatian tradition, but it's something that I've learned from the life of Ignatius. It's harder to do the right thing when you're surrounded by badness than to do the right thing when you're surrounded by goodness. So being humble doesn't mean subjugating your voice in any way. I think it means not starting with the premise that mine is the only voice and it is accurate. And it is fully accurate, not just for me, but for you, so shut up. So I think you have to defend yourself. I think it takes a lot of courage and badassery to be humble.
You said badassery?
Yeah, I think that's a word, and if it's not, I came from the Bronx, and you got a problem with that? Oh, okay, good. Badassery, I think that's a good word. I think that's a good word.
Thank you for your contribution.
I got a question. So, you mentioned no one is the center of the world. How if one of us ceased to exist, nothing would truly happen to the world. But I argue that one of our disappearances would deeply break the world for someone we hold dear, as I believe that each and every one of us has a world of our own and people in it. So my question is, how do we express humility without words to those we hold dear?
Without what?
How do we express humility to those we hold dear?
Yeah, I think you have to be open to being vulnerable. It's very, very hard to go to a brother that you don't respect who has hurt you when you're the one who did something wrong. And that's Erev Yom Kippur. That's the lesson that I learned from my rabbi friend of Erev Yom Kippur, that you just have to ask, if you are a person who prays, or if you're a person who meditates, or whatever your centering thing is to ask for the courage to do the right thing. Because in the ritual of Erev Yom Kippur, the other person forgiving you is not part of the equation. Your job is to ask for forgiveness. If they don't forgive you, that's on them, but it doesn't denigrate the bravery that it took. And I'm a big fan of believing that the love we have for someone is more than the break between the two of you. And this is something I practice very poorly in my own life.
Christopher, thanks for the wonderful talk. I was as you were addressing the topic, I was thinking of Ignatius, but I was also thinking of all the mystics. And in Ignatius you get the holy indifference, right? Santa indiferencia. You get it in John of the Cross. You get it in all the mystics who call for the need to detach, so that all things can be refound in God, right? And I think the great challenge of our times is the over-attachment to particular ideas, persons, idols, or anyone who claims to stand in the place of the sacred and of God. And so I was just thinking how, yes, the cultivating this great virtue of humility, and you certainly addressed us as a nation, is so necessary at this time. But it's not just for this nation, but for the world, right? I always say, as a theologian, that we take the creation narrative, and we were created in God's image, in this wonderful diversity. But we turn that around and we say to everybody else, you were created in my image. And so we create idols, right? And so idolatry is the big threat in our times. And I just think that it is, we have a theological problem. Of course, this is just, this is as a theologian, that's what, but we have a great theological problem, is that we have created idols when we should just look at ourselves as creatures of the Creator. So anyway, thank you for your...
Thank you. Beautifully eloquent. Thank you. We have a question.
I can stand up.
We want to get you on the audio, ma'am, so I'm going to come on over here.
I can stand up so you can hear me.
Okay.
I just wanted to mention another dimension to... Okay. I just wanted to mention another dimension of our discussion. The St. Teresa of Avila. I just finished a class in the writings of St. Teresa, and one of the writings we did was The Interior Castle, which is her guide to the spiritual life. She's constantly talking about humility. It's one of her big themes in the whole book. So I suggest that we could bring that into this discussion too. She certainly agrees with you.
She says, in fact, that it's the first room.
Yes.
And I think she says, if you're only going to revisit one room, make it that room. It's something like that. Doesn't she say bees? I think she says humility are like bees. They're always buzzing and they're always making something sweet. They're always making honey. And you don't value it except when they're not there. Yeah, I think she uses, I think it's in Interior Castles. Thank you.
I have one more to add, and then maybe we have time for a couple more after that, but it seems to me, again, more like in the age in which we dwell, that we have, we have to put our foot out in the world. And so maybe you curate yourself. I'm not sure if you're on Snapchat or Insta or something, and you have a profile. And that's an I statement, isn't it? Because it's very self-forward. I mean, I'm driving down the street, I see some kid stopping with his camera, taking pictures of himself. I would never do that growing up. I'm like, it's just new to me to see. He's probably sharing his life, but I'm like, that seems to be kind of self-involved. So on the one hand, I kind of worry about that. Do you hear me? Why for humility? Because like if we get so self-centered, we can get locked in ourselves. Do you ever feel like you're locked in yourself? And then when I turn out from myself to someone else, I feel like I'm liberated in a certain way. How would you think about that kind of thing?
Yeah, just to give an example of my own life, my wife is a jeweler, and on the weekends, shiny happy dangles if you're wondering, on the weekends we do craft shows, and in the rest of the week if you're a teacher, you're kind of the show, right? On the weekends, she's the show. I lift the boxes. She actually gave me a shirt with her logo, and it says Roadie on the back. And I really enjoy.
Yeah.
Now, even saying that makes it sound like I'm not being humble, right? Because look at me, I'm supporting my wife. But for me, what I like is being in the background, and that makes me feel good about me, because it's her show.
And the care you're showing her, like a love language almost, right?
Yeah, when I do stuff wrong, but which I do, put stuff up wrong and things like that. But it's that. I think we have to get comfortable with you first, not me first. And I take selfies too, so I'm just as guilty as other people, right? But it's the language of the world and our country today is me first. And there's a lot in Judeo-Christian, Muslim, and non-religious traditions, and Hinduism and Buddhism and other traditions, that's fundamentally based in you first. The Constitution, which Dr. Diaz knows gazillion times more than I do, is a balance between the common good and the individual rights. And we can be out of balance. And my own feeling is we are way out of balance right now in terms of my rights.
It's very clear, thank you. One or two more? Yeah, thank you. Allie, good to see you.
I don't even know who you are, but nice to see you, Ellie.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an environmental student, so I wanted to ask if there's any aspect of the environment that can be taken into humility. I feel like a lot about what we talked about is very person-to-person focused, but also like how can we be humble towards the environment, because without the earth there wouldn't be people. And you can look at like COVID as a humbling experience because the earth kind of like was a slap in the face, kind of like, hey, if you don't take care of me, like I can't take care of you. So
Yeah, I mean, I think the entire debate about, climate change is ridiculous. You can't say, I can say a banana is a crayon, but it's not going to, make it a crayon, right? The climate is changing. There can be an argument, I guess, as to whether or not it's made by human beings or not, but the fact is, look at the last couple of summers around the world, something's going on. And so I think, to me, that's terrifying because, I'm going to be dead in 40 years, but my daughter's going to be still alive, and maybe I'll have grandchildren, and they're still going to be alive. And so I think it's this notion that it's the lack of humility. Well, this isn't a problem. Let someone else worry about that. Well, those people are going to be carrying your DNA, and I don't want to see them fried, And so the Native Americans have this wonderful notion that no one owns the land, that we are stewards of creation, right? And so that's a very humble approach. And so in terms of climate change and doing the things that we can to help climate change, I think that there is a link there. But there's something that we always say, Mother Teresa's famous line, right? I can't take care of starvation around the world, but I can feed this person who's in front of me. It's not going to work with climate change. We need to work together on a massive scale. But it's by accepting the fact that if we don't, we're going to be eaten by the trouble that we've caused.
Yeah, I did have one follow-up because you were talking about Native Americans. I'm also learning a bit about indigenous practices and their mentalities, especially related to the earth. And there's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass talks about grammar of animacy and how we also have to look at things in our environment and even people as having animacy and not going in a very noun-based world, but more of a verb-based world, and respecting that things have movement to them and breath and a spirit, and that maybe that has to tie into humility as well.
Yeah, that's magnificent. That's a great imagery. Thank you for that.
That's First Nations spirituality, but I would say it's also St. Francis of Assisi, the siblinghood of nature, the relationality. He got out of that one, a family, a gift, more than dominion, for example.
And that's really the message of Pope Francis's Laudato Si, which is taken from Francis of Assisi, praise be you, Lord, brother, sun, and sister moon, in the canticle of brother, sun, and sister moon. But it is, if you read Laudato Si, it's a very political statement, not Democrat, Republican, but we're all in this together, dudes.
Last one, anybody? Okay, good, thanks we can do two more, one here, right in this row. Good row here.
They're winning,
Yeah, I want to commend you on this row.
just letting you know.
You're welcome.
So you mentioned that you feel like there's a large empathy gap in our world today.
Yeah.
So my question was, how do you feel like that empathy gap plays out today in religious institutions, or what is the role of religious institutions in bridging that empathy gap?
So I can really only speak about my institution, which is Catholicism, just the one that I study and the one in which I live. And I don't think that we have learned the lesson. So before many of you were born, the big clergy sex abuse scandal broke in January of 2002 in the Boston Globe. But that was just one reflection of a worldwide problem. 20 years out, and I'd like to know if you agree with me or not, now that we've had a whole new generation of bishops, I would say most of them still haven't gotten the memo. And so they're still doing things like scapegoating gay men to say that this is some sort of homosexual thing, when every study on the planet says that pedophilia and homosexuality have nothing to do with each other. And so I'm very discouraged by that empathy gap that's within my own tradition. I might be emphasizing the negative there, but it can only be in identifying the gap that we can address the gap.
Thank you very much. Right here, this will be our last one, but you can hang around and talk. All right, this is what we're here for.
Hi, when you talk about the virtue of humility, I'm wondering what you think is more important, like humility in knowing your place in like humanity in society, or like, do you think it's more important that we look at it more than that, and like knowing your place in terms of God or something more?
I wouldn't separate the two. My own training is that I could not separate those two. I experienced the love of God through the love my parents had for me, for better and for worse. You know, all sons and fathers clash, and there were times in my life where I saw God as a chastising parent because my father was a chastising parent. So I would not agree with your premise. I think that one has something to do with the other, because we only understand abstract things relationally. So that's my answer.
You have a question? Yeah, hold on a second. We'll do one more, everybody, one more.
A Cowboys fan in Chicago Bears territory.
Sorry, before I ask the question, you should not get mistaken. I'm no Cowboys fan.
Okay,
I'm a Lions
just-
fan, just so you know. I don't even-
Duly noted.
We don't have to say anything else about that. But I mean, like, I guess this does kind of connect to the topic, though. How does humility play a role in policy making?
How does humility play a role in policymaking? So policymaking fails if it's I'm right and you're wrong. Policymaking works, and again, I have a much more experienced person in the room than I am, but I'm thinking of like policy and self-government on my campus where I'm involved in union negotiations. We all have to realize that this time around, it's 70-30 your way. Next time around, it'll be 60-40 my way, and then let's go have a beer. And I think that's because we realize that we're in this together this way. It goes back to the relationality question, right? But when policy making is, we're going to make the policy and you're going to shut up and eat it, that's a formula for disaster.
Chris Bellitto, that was so good, so helpful, so nourishing. Let's show our appreciation for Dr. Bellitto.
Thank you very much.